Hello and welcome to Fighting Through Writing, your foray into the weird and wonderful world of competitive sports fiction. My name is Paul. I'm a competitive sports fiction writer who, for 15 years, has been detailing the trials, triumphs, and tribulations of our protagonist, El Pablo, as he seeks to prove himself worthy of taking on the legacy of his famous Mexican wrestling family, a legacy he has always been denied by his vengeful uncle, Villano. Now, before we get into this video, I do just want to say a massive thank you to everybody who watched my previous video. It is now officially my most viewed video on this channel of all time. So yeah, super cool, super glad that everything that I was talking about in there kind of resonated with everyone. So thank you all so much. Now, in that video, we were reflecting on the Rumble for the Roses, the most recent pay-per-view of the EWC, the pro wrestling company in which El Pablo is currently competing. It was a show on which Pablo had not one, but two championship defenses, and ultimately led to me in real life writing for nearly 24 hours in a single sitting to try and get our stories for those matches put together. To mixed success. Although, if I was to pick one of those two matches to win, then I suppose keeping hold of the Undisputed Championship for a little while longer is the option that I would go with. But in coming out of that show, I found myself thinking that I cannot, physically, mentally kind of afford to make that kind of writing session a habit. So I thought for this next match, to try and speed things along a little bit, I would kind of break with tradition and kind of go against the pantsing kind of philosophy that I usually write with. And I thought I would try and plan this next story out a little bit more, or at least kind of go for the brain dump approach and just try and get a few ideas kind of penciled out in advance. So I kind of knew a bit more the direction that I wanted this promo and this chapter to kind of take, and then hopefully when it came time to actually writing it and tying it all together, it would all go a little bit quicker. Now, did that work? No, it did not. Because I still, even with all of that, found myself not submitting the piece until 2:30 a.m. on deadline day. And it was so late, in fact, that I have not actually read back what I wrote and what I submitted. So, as the title of this video suggests, I thought it might be quite fun for us to go through together and react in real time to what I wrote, what I submitted, and then go through the scorecards that the EWC judges use and see if we can kind of guess how it's going to fare, whereabouts it's going to sit in terms of the rankings, and what chance that might give us of picking up the victory. So before we get into the actual writing itself, let's set the scene a little bit. So this match took place on Monday Night Brawl, the EWC's flagship programming, their longest running show, their most prestigious brand, I guess, in a lot of ways. It was episode number 629, which by the time you guys are watching this will have taken place on August the 11th, live from the State Farm Arena in Atlanta, Georgia. And the match in question is El Pablo versus the new international champion, Melody Malone. Now, I have touched briefly on Melody in one of my previous videos when we faced her and Peach Gelato on a previous episode of Paramount, which is another EWC brand. But suffice to say that she is one of the greatest, most successful, most highly regarded superstars in the history of the EWC. She is already in the Hall of Fame. She's a 3-time undisputed champion. She's a former United States champion, former tag team champion, FSW champion. As I said, she's obviously currently the international champion. She's the only 3-time EWC Rumble winner in the history of the company. And she is someone who has had a storied history, shall we say, with El Pablo. Now, the two first faced each other, I believe, at the start of 2022 in just kind of a general exhibition match. Melody won that match, but the match that took their relationship or their rivalry to new heights was right at the other end of that season, which was WrestleFest, the final pay-per-view of the year, where the two of them faced off as part of a fatal four-way match for the EWC EWC Undisputed Championship. In the course of that match, Melody Malone skewered El Pablo in the chest with a broken light tube, almost fully. I mean, Pablo was Rufio and she was Captain Hook, that kind of thing. The two then faced off against each other again later that next year in 2023 as part of the Paramount Brands Uprising pay-per-view, with the stipulation being that if Pablo won, he would get a shot at the Undisputed Championship then held by Narumi Satsumi, whereas if Malone won, she would get some unknown reward that ultimately ended up basically being her becoming a member of the EWC's kind of upper management. And Pablo won that match, so he gained retribution for his attempted murder at WrestleFest and booked himself a ticket to go and fight one-on-one for the Undisputed Championship that he did not win. But hey, it's all good now. He has that belt currently for at least a little while longer, at least 2 more weeks before he has to defend it again. As for Melody, even though she lost that match, that was kind of the end of her full-time in-ring EWC career. At that point, she kind of took a step back, and it's only really this season that she's really come back kind of full time, which, you know, just on a personal note is great. I love the Melody Malone character. I think she is, Anna the writer is genuinely one of my favorite writers in this entire company. She's super talented and has always towed the line really well between writing this kind of all-conquering supervillain effectively, but still showing those little glimpses at her kind of human side and her frailties, and, you know, still making that character be someone that you ultimately are invested in and want to kind of see what happens going forward. But yeah, always a pleasure to go up against Anna, always a pleasure to go up against Melody Malone, and so I was super excited for the opportunity to test my mettle against her once again in this match. And the beauty of having an opponent with whom you already share such a rich kind of history with, I suppose, is that it takes a lot of the pressure away in terms of, you know, I don't need to dig through the archives to kind of know what her record is or know her kind of personality traits and things like that, because I already know it. I've already read pretty much everything that she's put forward. So from that side of things, it's all second nature really, and it all just makes that side of things a lot easier. And so if I head over to the brain dump that I made for this match, a significant chunk of it is about kind of the arguments of, you know, what her relationship is to El Pablo, how El Pablo thinks that he can beat her, and what the kind of pitfalls he thinks will be that he needs to look out for. But obviously, as with any pro wrestling promo or just any writing in general, you don't just want to focus on that side of things. You also want to flesh out the character side of things a little bit more and tell your own character's story from outside of this and outside whatever's going on in this particular instance, and how does it fuel the themes and the story that you're currently telling as a whole. So I knew that I wanted to have a scene opening up where it's Pablo in, I wasn't sure whether to have either the EWC Hall of Fame or kind of the Volando Hall of Fame, his family's Hall of Fame, and in either one it's him standing there holding the 3 belts that he was holding a few months ago, but suddenly the walls start closing in on him and he finds himself running into the darkness, essentially towards the far end of the room, trying to save himself and his belts. And you have a hippo dives in and snatches one of the belts away from him, which is representing Berto, and Hippo taking the international belt off of him. You then have ninjas snatching the tag belts off of him, just as his stablemates, the Bloody Shuriazu, took the tag belts off of him at the Rumble. And finally, Pablo makes it to the end, to this Technicolor throne. And then I wasn't sure whether to have a bit where he sees his brother Vertigo kind of left behind in the rubble or kind of stuck behind him, and he reaches out to try and save him, but Vertigo kind of pulls his hand away and just kind of walks off of his own volition. Because I spoke in the last video about how now that Pablo and Vertigo lost the tag belts, which is the third time that they've won it and not been able to hold it for any kind of length of time, I'm not really sure how viable that is as a story for me to carry on, or I just don't really feel like, for whatever reason, I can kind of do that story justice. And I think there is the opportunity there to kind of frame it as Vertigo kind of sacrificing himself so that Pablo can focus on keeping his undisputed championship run going. So yeah, that was one of the options. And then it ultimately ends in this sense of kind of pressure building and building, and then suddenly a bottle cap opens, and we then cut to Pablo being in the World of Coca-Cola Museum in Atlanta, which is obviously where this show is set. And I went for the Coca-Cola idea partly because Pablo and Melody are very corporately minded, is the best way I can put it, I suppose. So Pablo obviously has his Skittles endorsement and this long-running relationship with them, whereas Melody, she's been the face of Dior. She's, I think, worked with Paramount, as in pictures, various other bits and pieces. But like Pablo, she's always looking at kind of things she can do outside the ring to kind of enhance her image and all that sort of stuff. And I also wanted to go for the museum because there's an exhibit there called the Vault of the Secret Formula, with the association being that the last time, or certainly after last time, that Pablo and Melody fought each other, he'd almost resigned himself to the fact that the secret formula for becoming undisputed champion was something that was always going to evade him, basically. So I thought that was quite a cool little juxtaposition there. I also had an idea of having Playboy Cardi make a cameo appearance because, well, one, he's from Atlanta, and two, when I was thinking about ideas for this promo, his song Timeless that he did with The Weeknd kind of popped into my head, with just for the lyrics, and they're like, ever since I was a kid, knew I was the shit. And that being, again, a nice little juxtaposition with the Pablo story, because he did not know that. He, was very much made to feel like that was not the case. But as I was kind of researching Carti and thinking of, just trying to get an idea of how to write him, it then became quite apparent that he's not really one anymore for interviews or public appearances or things like that. But then I thought we can play off of that, because the last time I had a promo set in Atlanta, I had Pablo hanging out with Offset and Quavo from Migos, and was told after the fact that by someone that they thought I should have been docked points for research, because apparently they are not on the best of terms, or they weren't on the best of terms at the time. So I thought we could play on that and say, the last time Pablo was in Atlanta, he managed to bring about an improbable reconciliation between those two, but apparently getting a public appearance from the notoriously reclusive Carti appears to be even beyond the scope of the power of the Rainbolution. I also thought we could then have a bit where it's kind of Carti's there, but it's like he's AI and speaking only in song titles, sort of like that old episode of South Park where Chef comes back after the actor who voiced him left the show, and they pretty much just played very obvious like sound bites from his previous appearances. And also I thought it would just be a nice little challenge to kind of try and weave a story while using song titles to kind of signpost it and see where it goes. And just adding into one of the ideas that we touched about in our Undisputed promo last time about how Pablo is really good at improvising when things don't necessarily go to plan, which is something that Melody Malone has quite often struggled with, or there's evidence we can look at as her having potentially struggled with in the past. And then the rest of the brain dump was basically just quotes and arguments that I thought I could pull on to kind of just flesh out the argument part of the story, I suppose. But yeah, so the brain dump, I think there was about 1,500 words in there, so a pretty significant amount, I thought. And I thought it would literally just be a case of fleshing out the first bit, because that was very kind of bullet pointy and just little snippets of ideas. But certainly the argument part was a lot more fleshed out, so I thought it would just be putting those things together. So I don't know whether I was just believing the propaganda that all you plotters have put into my head from my author tube journey so far, but yeah, did not pan out quite as easily as I'd hoped. I mean, it might also be my fault, because I probably did take it a bit for granted that, oh well, I've got all of this stuff written down, so it'll be easy, so I don't really need to work on it until deadline day, which, you know, in hindsight, maybe not the best idea, but time blindness is a very real thing. All that said, let's get into the writing. Let's get into looking back at the story and seeing what we think, seeing how it turned out. Because yeah, as I say, I have not read this. I normally will allow myself a bit of time to go back, and I don't even generally read through it myself. What I usually do is I get a text-to-speech program to read it back to me. So it's almost like you're listening to it in audiobook form. I mean, I generally find audiobooks easier to take in than normal novels anyway, but yeah, it kind of just helps me to sit there, just, you know, zone out and focus on what's being said back to me. And then if there's anything that I think needs tweaking or changing, I can kind of pause it, dip back in and just tweak it then and there. But yeah, with it being so late, I mean, I know that it got to the point where I was like, look, I just need to put something down. So I already know that the ending certainly isn't as strong as it could have been, because I was just done by that point. But yeah, let's see how we get on. I will leave a link in the description below for our WordPress site, so you can have a look there and you can read along with it as well if you like. I won't go, you know, word for word and recite it here, but we'll kind of skim over what's happening as I'm reading, and then we'll see if we can guess how it's going to be scored and how we might do. So we start with a quote from the song Timeless. Sun is shining, it's over, it's tomorrow. Bathe yourself in the light, in your love, which again I thought was quite a nice little metaphor for Pablo having made it out the other side of the Rumble and his defense against Ace, with the Undisputed Championship still intact, still on his shoulder, and that kind of almost that idea of calmness after the storm, I suppose. But yeah, we find ourselves in the EWC Hall of Fame with all these big pictures of its occupants kind of shimmering with this iridescent glow, and kind of this seeming like it's not entirely in reality, like it's a dream sequence almost. And Pablo's walking past various names, various legends from company past, and then he notices that the pictures slowly start to retreat into the walls that all at the same time start to close in on him, and that shine kind of gets dulled by this looming shadow that kind of takes everything over. But Pablo carries on, and just as he gets to Melody Malone, the entire building suddenly lurches to the left, knocks him off his stride, and nearly sends him tumbling through this hippo-shaped hole in the wall, through which he finds himself confronted by a dizzying view from an improbable altitude of international waters. But at the last second, throws himself to the right to avoid falling through the hole, lands on the floor beside a steady stream of what appears to be blood raining from the ceiling upon a pair of multicoloured disco lights. Slay, he thinks, because Bloody Shuriazu, I believe, translates to Bloody Slayers. Slayer, raining blood, disco lights. His team is the Silent Discotechnicos. You see what's going on there. And just when he thinks he's maybe, you know, avoided that danger, we then hear this rumbling from somewhere in the darkness, which turns out to be this huge wheel, like the wheel from The Price is Right, that comes barreling out of the darkness like a gaudy Vegas-inspired reimagining of Raiders of the Lost Ark, which represents Ace King, his best friend, the guy he just beat for the Undisputed Championship, and his former tag team partner in Russian Roulette. So Pablo turns, tries to outrun this wheel, and just as it appears to be catching up with him, he throws himself to the side. The wheel barrels past him and crashes into the wall at the far end of the room, and as the dust settles, Pablo finds himself confronted with the sight of himself, or at least his old self from when he first started in the wrestling business, sat on the Disco Technicolor throne, and he's kind of, clutching that belt to his chest, hyperventilating because he's just narrowly escaped destruction. And the two Pablos lock eyes, but before they can speak, they turn their attention above these walls to the distance where this shadow has converged to take the form of Pablo's uncle Viano, who extends a sinister hand towards them and engulfs the scene in darkness. And that is when the sound of a soda bottle popping open signals our arrival at the World of Coca-Cola Museum. And as its name suggests, the museum provides an insight into every stage of the fizzy pop production process, with a variety of exhibits allowing visitors to experience everything from fragrance and flavour to media and marketing. What better place then to stage a preview for Monday Night Brawl number 629's impending clash between two of the most infamously corporately minded individuals in the EWC history. And we find Pablo sitting at a bar backed by bottles containing countless Coca-Cola variations from around the world, and he's restless. He's his left leg is bouncing, he's distracted by something, chewing on his fingernails, and his mind is very much occupied by presumably thoughts of what's just happened and these kind of dreams that he's been having. Fortunately, the other visitors to the museum are rather more distracted by the sight of Playboy Carti sitting beside him, and they have a little back and forth with Carti talking purely in song titles and Pablo kind of reacting to them, kind of a bit more straight man than he normally is. Pablo is usually the one who is the wacky one in any kind of interaction, and I thought that would kind of play a little bit more into his distracted sort of mindset at this point. And after a little while, the bartender comes over and kind of says to Pablo, "You didn't really think this one through, did you?" And Pablo says, "No, but when the chips are down and the calls go unreturned, we do what we always do. We adapt, we innovate." And just like I told Ace before bagging myself perhaps the biggest endorsement possible of what I'm about to say in Pasadena, when it comes to thinking on your furry little feet in the heat of confrontation, there's few practitioners more potent than the clown prince of polychromatism. And then a little bit more back and forth, and Pablo ultimately takes his leave. He leaves Carti and the bartender on their own to their own devices, and then we catch up with Pablo a little while later at the Vault of the Secret Formula, where he is talking about how he had once come to think that the secret to Undisputed Championship success was one that would just remain locked away from him forever. He says he thought he'd cracked it once heading into WrestleFest 20, and to be fair, he was at the time the longest reigning X Division champion of all time, heading into a no DQ fatal four-way against two people he'd already gotten victories on record over. And he says, you can't blame him for being a little overconfident perhaps in those circumstances. But he says, as preposterous as it might sound, he underestimated Melody Malone, or at least he underestimated the lengths that she would go to and the depths to which she'd be willing to drag them all in the pursuit of getting what she felt like she was owed. And he said, I accept that. I underestimated you. That was a mistake, but still happens to the best of us, because he says she, Melody, has also underestimated him plenty of times in the past. So in the last match they had, which was a triple threat involving Peach Gelato as well, and it was I can't even remember what it was called now, but it was something like an AED rules match or something, where you had to basically beat your opponent up to such a degree that you then had to resuscitate them with an AED, which, pro wrestling. And before that match, Melody Malone said that she didn't think that Pablo had what it took to render either of his opponents in that kind of condition, being the good guy and the kind soul that he is, I suppose. But Pablo says, I proved you wrong. I did win that match. And I didn't beat you. I beat Peach Gelato, but either way, I proved you wrong. Just like I proved you wrong at Stranglemania when I became the Undisputed Champion, which was a belt that Melody, in the run-up to their match at WrestleFest, said that he wasn't fit to wear, said that if he were to do so, it would be an insult to everything that she had worked so hard at that point to create. And he says, ultimately, there was a time where the idea that Pablo being on the same kind of level as Melody Malone or as Ace King before her, would have been preposterous. But that time has very much been and gone. He says, somehow, miraculously, I've managed to drag this ragtag bag of feather boas and corporate sponsorships to the point where you and I might be conceivably considered to be evenly matched going into this thing. And sure, you could argue that a chunk of that's because you were otherwise engaged for about a year and a half, but let's not forget who it was that ultimately opened up that diary of yours in the first place. And Pablo then goes on to point out that, they've both got wins over each other, and even this season, the symmetry is kind of almost poetic. So while Melody has beaten Berto and Amish Shelton, two people that have beaten Pablo in quite high profile matches, Pablo in return has beaten Captain Morgan Darkwater and Ace King, which are two people that Melody has lost to. Yeah, whatever way you slice it, they're kind of very evenly matched going into this thing. And he says, in hindsight, Berto probably did me a favour taking that international title off me when he did, because from the moment you stepped out of that Maserati in Eugene and declared your interest in it, I can't deny that there was a familiar air of inevitability about the entire thing. But then that's always been the way with you, hasn't it, Mel? Everything you've set your mind to, the straps, the status, the spouse in waiting, the sponsorships, it's always been inevitable, which is another thing that she said on the eve of that match at WrestleFest, was that her becoming undisputed champion was inevitable. And Pablo says, you've always been so assured of your success and of yourself, and that ultimately is the real difference, because I never had that. Pablo never had that. He, even Malone winning the international championship at the Rumble, that was, in her mind, confirmation that she's well and truly back on her throne. And while Pablo would love to say that him retaining his undisputed belt against Ace King gave him that same sense of security, he's never really had that. He's never had that assuredness in his own identity and his own worth. He's always kind of defined himself in relation to other people purely because he had his identity kind of stripped away from him at such a young age, when Viano told him he wasn't allowed to be part of the family, part of that legacy. He wasn't allowed to take on the Volando name, so he's had to reinvent himself from the ground up. And yeah, he's never really known who El Pablo is in that sense. Yeah, he's never really been able to define himself on his own merits, if that makes sense. But he says, he's trying. This is a new thing that he's trying to do. And he says, again, harkening back to that match at WrestleFest, Melody said before that she recognized that for Pablo, beating her would be the perfect way to prove his legitimacy within the company. And Pablo says, while my retaining against Ace at the Rumble might have beaten this match on Monday Night to the Punch, as far as cementing my status as the undisputed champion goes, beating you again here in Atlanta would certainly serve as a delicious little cherry on the top. And Pablo then moves on to talking about how he's going to beat Melody. So he says, she's going to be riding high after winning the belt. She's also in a better run of form than he is. So her loss to Ace about a month ago is the only real blot on her copybook since Pablo beat her and Peach back few months ago. I can't remember exactly when. And he says that, some of the veteran instincts that she showed in matches since then kind of prove that even though she has taken a bit of hiatus, that kind of ring rust has clearly well and truly worn off now. And he says, so yeah, she should be very confident going into this thing. I mean, after all, Pablo's only won, by comparison, one win in his last four. And even though that one win was against Ace King for the Undisputed Championship, it could be said that he only won that match because Ace slipped off the top rope right at the end when he was looking to finish him off, and that gave Pablo the opening to hit him with his own finish and pick up the win. And Pablo says, but is it not also true that the only reason that Ace was on that top rope was because Pablo, even after going through a war against the Shuriazu at the start of that show, still managed to take Ace to the point where he had to kind of throw his own game plan out the window, and he had had to try and improvise, which Pablo is far better at certainly than Ace is, and also than Melody is. He says, Melody, you are unquestionably one of the best to ever do it when you're in control. But every so often, things can get a little loosey-goosey. And when that happens, the inevitable can quickly start to seem just a little more evitable. He says, the match she lost against Ace was a rule swap match where basically every time one of the competitors hit a buzzer at ringside, the stipulation would change. He says that, element of surprise cut off any attempt at strategy or forward thinking. And also her loss to Morgan Darkwater came about when Darkwater applied Melody's own submission move on her, kind of caught her off guard in that sort of sense. So there's that kind of thinking that if her game plan goes out of the window, she kind of struggles to think of a plan B, and that hesitation and that uncertainty can kind of give someone who is a lot more instinctive and thrives a lot more on chaos that opening to take advantage. He says even in our match at Uprising, the thing that ultimately shifted the tide was her best laid plans going awry because she couldn't exercise the spirit of what she'd already tried to kill 6 months prior. So I think she went for a chair on the outside of the ring and went to try and attack Pablo with it, but hesitated, threw it out the ring, and that ultimately gave Pablo the opening to cut her off and get the win. So he says, I beat you that night, and if I can do it again in this one, if I can throw you off your game, use my speed and innovation and improvisation to conjure up just enough chaos to make you uncomfortable and bring out that more frustrated, impulsive, more reckless side of you, I know that I can beat you again. Not in the name of legacy or legitimacy, just for me. And admittedly, to send a message to the two who'll be tussling for a shot at this in the match right after ours, but you know what I'm saying, meaning the Undisputed Championship, because the match right after Pablo and Malone is Amish Shelton against Narumi Satsumi, with the winner being the number one contender to Pablo's Undisputed Championship. And we finish with Pablo standing by a pedestal at the far end of the vault where a bottle holding the original Coca-Cola recipe stands. Pablo says, on August 11th, two of the EWC's leading lights are going to step into the State Farm Arena seeking to cement their status as the centerpiece of their particular pro wrestling playground. But while the Queen's irrepressible fire might have breathed new life into this latest leg of her career, this battle against the leader of the Rainbowlution's ultimately going to see her ambitions of being seen once again as the very best die lit, which obviously, as I'm sure we all know, is a Playboy Carti reference, to trying to bring that kind of full circle again, and ends with Pablo saying, Viva la Rainbowlution. I'll drink to that, grabs the bottle, takes a swig, and then security come after him and he sprints out the vault, and that's it. There's a scratching on the door. What did you think? Did you think it was good? Did you think it was a good story? Do you think I can win? Do you think I nailed all the points? And what do you think? No? Stop that now. Stop twerking. Let's get straight into the scorecard then, and we can kind of dissect as we go and see if we can second guess how we think this thing is going to fare with the judges. So, as I've talked about before on this channel, every piece of writing that gets submitted to the EWC gets judged against an official scorecard, which is broken down into 5 different sections. So you've got relevancy, you've got argument, character work, flow, and creativity/entertainment, and each section has their own little sub criteria and specific weighting that goes into that, and at the end of it you're given a score out of 28, and whichever piece of writing, whichever character is judged to have the highest average score wins the fight. So in terms of relevancy, is it clear who the opponent is? Yes, it is. It's Melody Malone. Is the match and any special stipulation covered? Well, there isn't really a special stipulation. It's just a normal singles match, but we did mention that there was a match happening. And is the content of the piece balanced, or is it kind of lopsided towards argument or character or one thing or another? I think it's pretty balanced. I think there's a good kind of, we've obviously got the first scene with Pablo and his kind of dream, and then the second part is all about the argument and the match itself. So I would say personally, I think there's quite a good balance there. In terms of argument, was the argument logical and got over why and how they'd win? Yes, I think it was. I think we made a couple of very good points, and I think we backed those points up with evidence and research and things that we'd noticed in Melody's previous promos and previous matches. Did the argument sell the wrestler, match type, stakes, and opponent? Yes, I think we did. I think we definitely talked up our history with Melody and her status as a Hall of Famer and as this all-conquering, intimidating, one of the best to ever do it. So personally, yes, I think that's full marks on that one. Did the argument demonstrate that the wrestler knew their opponent? Again, yes, I feel like we did. I think we played very strongly on the history between Melody and Pablo. And did the wrestler get any glaring facts wrong about the opponent or event? As far as I know, no, I don't think I did. I think I got all the show numbers correct and all the timelines in order. So I'm going to say, no, we did not get any glaring facts wrong. Yeah, personally, I think that the argument part in this piece was really thorough. I made a bit of a concerted effort to really hone in on that, because the last few pieces that I've done, with the exception of the Ace King match, the feedback that I've had has been that it's been very character weighted, with kind of holes in some of the arguments. So with the brain dump, I really tried to use that to get the arguments all planned out and fleshed out well ahead of time, just to kind of make sure that we got those marks this time. The irony with that is that I do think, reading back on it, I may have overcorrected, and while there was character stuff in there, I don't know that I really fleshed it out or kind of tied it back to what was happening in the match, that kind of thing. I think the ideas were there, but I think I could have grounded them a little bit better. So in terms of the character section, did the RP further the character as a person? Yes, I think it did, with the dream sequence and Pablo also talking about how he's in this new phase of his life and he's trying to, get to the point where he can judge himself and appreciate himself on his own merits, rather than comparing himself to everyone else and kind of comparing himself to the person he was back the previous time that he and Melody fought each other. So yes, I think we did. Did the promo further the character in regard to their EWC career? Sort of, maybe. We touched on the fact that this is an opportunity for Pablo to send a message to Armis and Narumi, who are fighting to be his number one contender. Also on the fact that, again, this match is an opportunity for him to further cement his status as the undisputed champion after successfully defending against Ace at the Rumble. Again, I don't know that I really honed in or kind of tied the knots on that as firmly as I could have done. So I will say somewhat on that one. I don't think it would get the full marks, but there was definitely some stuff there, but just maybe not as fleshed out as it could have been. Did the promo have characters' emotions and mannerisms on display through visual or somatic aspects? Yes, I think it did. I think there was a lot of, just scene direction and showcasing kind of what Pablo was doing and how he was feeling at the time. And did the promo have world building to further your storyline and argument as a whole? Again, a bit, but I think I could have built on the world a little bit more. Like, why was Playboy Cardi there? I know it was we more focused on the fact that he wasn't there as an excuse for Pablo to show off his improvisation and use that as a comparison to Melody Malone's relative inability to do that. And it kind of worked on that sense, but I suppose we could have said why Cardi in the first place and what, if any, his relation to Pablo is. So again, I'll say somewhat. I think the ideas we definitely had the ideas there, but I think, again, they could have been grounded a little bit more firmly. In terms of flow, was the promo easy to read and follow from start to finish? Yes, I think so. Was it clear, either through scene or dialogue, that the piece came to a logical ending or conclusion? Now, I have had a bit of a bee in my bonnet the last couple of bits of writing that I've done where I have been deducted points purely because I wasn't writing like the scene fades to black or the camera cuts, and I understand why, if you were writing it as a screenplay, that's the kind of thing that you would put in there. But at no point have I been writing any of these most recent pieces as a screenplay. And I think that you can end a piece and have it feel like the end of a piece without just going the end or the camera cuts. So that said, I did kind of throw my hands up and just decide to play ball with this one. I think partly because I was just frantically rushing to get it done. So I did, stick a bit more scene direction in there, I suppose, of camera fading, or we cut to the next scene. So yes, I think those transitions were there. Like I said at the start, I don't think the ending was particularly logical, in the sense that it did kind of come out of nowhere in the piece, mostly because it also came out of nowhere in my brain, because I was thinking, well, I need a way to finish this. And I think that is the problem that I found with, again, kind of overcorrecting from previous pieces, where I went all in on fleshing the arguments out and getting them all sorted, but I didn't really have a plot for the piece. No, I had, again, the idea of starting with a dream sequence and holding it at World of Coca-Cola and the Vault of the Secret Formula, but I didn't really have a narrative in mind in terms of, how it was going to start versus how it was going to finish. So I would, I think, dock myself a point for that, the ending not being as logical as it could have been. That said, did the promo transition smoothly from scene to scene? Yes, it did, and I swear to Christmas, if I see a single point docked for that. Did the promo transition smoothly between thoughts? Yes, relatively to Pablo's kind of scatterbrain anyway. Was it clear on who was speaking and when or what was thoughts versus narration? Yes, I think so. And was the promo appropriately paced, or did it feel rushed / too long? I think it felt pretty appropriately paced. It clocked in at, I think it was just over 3,000 words. It might have been 3.5, which is a pretty significant chunk of writing in the context of this kind of competitive flash fiction writing sort of thing. That's a pretty significant chunk. But I, reading back through it here, I do think it warrants the length that it is, if that makes sense. I don't think it particularly drags at any point. And while the ending, does come a bit out of nowhere in itself, I do think we got to a point where the ending should be, if that makes sense. So I will give myself a generous yes for it being appropriately paced. And then in terms of creativity and entertainment, finally, these are the kind of intangibles of, it's something that's, you can't necessarily check or fact check or anything like that, but it's more open to the judge's interpretation, I suppose. So location, did we get a sense of the world around the wrestler, and was the location creatively used to further the role play? I would give myself a partially effective here. Again, I don't feel like I can give myself the full marks, just because I think I could have made more of the location rather than just having Pablo be there. I possibly could have interacted with things a bit more. I do think I made it pretty clear why we were there and, tied it into the whole theme of the piece that way. But I don't know. I still feel like I could have made better use of it as a physical space for Pablo to exist in. So I'd say partially effective for that. Did the promo elicit a reaction? Did you laugh? Did you gasp? Did you cry? That sort of thing. Yes, I thought it was funny, but I am very biased, obviously. And overall entertainment value of the promo, I was engaged the entire time. So again, a very biased score from that sort of thing. But again, for all its potential flaws as a purely box ticking exercise, I had fun writing it. I enjoyed writing it, and it was good fun kind of reading it back as well. But all of that said, if I was to be grading this myself, I would give it a total score of 24 out of 28, which on the face of it sounds like a very good score. There was just a couple of bits in terms of character and world building, I suppose, that I think we could have done a little bit better on. Now, is that going to be enough to beat Melody Malone and to beat Anna? I don't think so. And that's fine. Like I've said before, Anna is an incredible writer. She's got the Melody Malone character down. She's already obviously achieved so much with her. So, you know, you've got to really be on your A game consistently to get the win against her. And I don't think we were here. Like, I still think it was good, but yeah, I am not expecting to get the win in this one. But either way, we will have to wait and see until the next episode to discover how El Pablo fares in his fight against Melody Malone. I am going to leave it here for now. I hope you all enjoyed this little impromptu kind of read along and live reactions to something that I wrote myself. And I guess also dispelling some of the myths around plotting versus pantsing. It's not always all it's cracked up to be. As always, like I said, I will leave a link in the description below where you can go and read this piece for yourself if you haven't already. In our next episode, we will be reacting to the result of this match and also preparing to defend the undisputed championship once again against either Amish Shelton or Narumi Satsumi in what will hopefully be a little less frantic and a little less sleep deprived an affair. But yes, hopefully see you on that episode. Thank you very much for joining me for this one. Please like the video, share, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff, and I shall see you next time on Fighting Through Writing.